Welcome to American Muse Podcast, where we explore hidden secrets in the landscape of 19th and 20th century American orchestral music. Your host is Dr. Grant Gilman, conductor, violinist, and author based in Atlanta, Georgia. In each episode, Grant unearths a fresh orchestral work by an American composer you may not even know. And by the end, we hope you are a new fan of the composer and the music. Now, your host, Maestro Grant Gilman.
So, our guest today on American Muse Podcast is a Grammy-winning conductor, music director of the Buffalo Philharmonic Orchestra, music director laureate of the Virginia Symphony Orchestra, where I happen to have met her, principal guest conductor of the Brevard Festival, and recently appointed artistic advisor to the Cleveland Institute of Music Orchestra. She has guest conducted many of the most prominent orchestras in America, Canada, Europe, Asia, and South America. That list is getting... it's harder and harder to leave things off of that list. She's the leading recording artist for Naxos and won her most recent Grammy in 2019 as conductor of the London Symphony for Spiritualist by Kenneth Fuchs. Additionally, she served as principal conductor of the Ulster Orchestra, with whom she made her Proms debut and recorded 6 highly acclaimed Naxos discs, including a 2-volume set of the orchestral works of John Knowles Paine, which is a favorite of mine. She is a member of the esteemed American Academy of Arts and Sciences, has served as a member of the National Council on the Arts, is the recipient of many of the most prestigious conducting awards, and was named Performance Today's Classical Woman of the Year. COVID-19 limitations permitting, she can be seen on the podium of the Buffalo Philharmonic this season, and hopefully other worldwide orchestras. And believe it or not, that was the short version of the bio. So, JoAnn Falletta, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Grant. It's great to see you again and great to have a chance to chat. I remember our chats in Virginia, how much fun they were.
Yeah, always at Chocolage, or most of the time anyway.
Yeah.
And before and after they moved across the street.
That's right. Well, those were good times then, really.
Yeah. Well, and now you move on to other things, bigger and more developed all the time. You don't stay still.
Well, although I have to say, I was traveling a lot, but since March, since actually our concert in Virginia was canceled, really at the last moment because of the virus, it's been very much quieter than I'm used to, but
right.
It's been good in its own way. And certainly it's given us a chance to plan for the future too, and to see what will happen. Right.
So when we spoke over email, you mentioned that the Buffalo Philharmonic is actually going to start up. So yes. What that seems pretty striking to me. Considering, at least news-wise, what has come out of New York ever since this started. What can you tell us about that situation and how everyone came to the decision to move forward?
Right. Well, actually, in New York was the epicenter of the virus, but thanks to our governor, Governor Cuomo, who's been very tough on lockdown in New York, and we've gotten to a much better place. And Buffalo, of course, is not close to New York, so it's a different environment. But it was very important to the community, I think, that we keep playing, and very important to keep our musicians employed and playing. So we, Grant, if you can imagine, we started the season. Our season was initially a very big one, as normally, and we're trying to use all of our 85 people, and I had to keep changing the repertoire, and so I've probably gone through about 12 or 13 permutations of the season, and we are starting quite small, and this is for safety. We've got we're really, really being careful. We're starting with 20 people. A mixture of strings and winds, and we've planned for that 20 to take us into December, and then hopefully from December on we can begin increasing the size.
Interesting. Is it the same 20, or is it kind of like a rotating 20?
No, it's a rotating 20, and also different instrumentation. Mostly strings, as you can imagine, but we're also trying to do pieces that are winds only, and all kinds of different things that we probably would never have considered. Given the kind of orchestra we are normally. Right. But in a way, I think I came to a very important turning point for me when I stopped regretting what we couldn't do this year and started to get very excited about what we could do. Done Barton Oaks by Stravinsky. Later in the year, Gina Stara variaciones concertantes, things that we might not do because they're smaller.
Right.
And that seemed very exciting. All of a sudden we could do those things. So we're starting out with that and then gradually getting bigger, of course, with the guidelines that we have. But
Right.
it feels so good to get back to it. I mean, we already had we recorded 3 concerts for streaming, and it just felt so good to be on the stage making music. So that's good. We feel like we're getting through it now. We're starting to.
Right. Right. I mean, and it's good that Buffalo's, Buffalo seems like it's been healthy or more healthy, orchestra business wise than a lot of other orchestras anyway. Unlike, Nashville just kind of ended all of next season, and while that obviously has a lot to do with COVID, but it seems like because not every single orchestra is completely folded up for the following season, there's probably something else that was going on there that just kind of tipped them over the edge.
I think it is complicated. I mean, we have certain advantages here in Buffalo in that we manage our hall. So we have complete control over our hall, which has really helped us. And we don't pay for our use of the hall. So that maybe is a single luckiest thing. But the community has always been extremely supportive of the orchestra. We have a very, very active and strong board and a great executive director in Dan Hart. And I think that all of that, when we got to this crisis point, gave us the tools to get through it, or at least to get through it, or to plan to get through it.
Right.
We will.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess all you could do at the moment is make a plan and then blow it all up as it goes along. Basically, depending on what happens or doesn't happen, you can go forward, and then if it doesn't work out, then you do something else.
Right, and we're starting cautiously, and we've got lots of safety things in place. We've bought a lot of plexiglass, and very careful about spacing with the musicians. Very careful about cleaning, but it seems to be working so far. So
right. No, I'm sure you'll find a way to do something and keep afloat. Even for us in Alpharetta, I mean, we've been talking about, okay, we're going to survive this year somehow. That's what we're going to do, so that when it's over and whatever the world looks like afterwards doesn't really matter. So you're programming in Buffalo and Virginia, and of course anywhere you've guest conducted, you've included American composers throughout your career. So was that a specific conscious decision at a particular moment, or was it something that came about over time through all of that programming, or was it like a strategy?
No, it really developed very organically by my time in school, because of course, as you did when I went to school too, we studied the great masters, as conductors. We weren't studying new music. Really, we might study Stravinsky, but we weren't studying new music. But being in school, being at Madison, being at Juilliard, we were in the middle of composers. They were our friends. And I remembered all the wonderful friendships I had, Richard Daniel Ford, Kenneth Hughes, people that I'm very close to. And the idea that they needed advocates, became very clear. And that they, were also willing to have a young conductor do their piece. They were thrilled to have a young conductor do their piece. And I thought, well, that I want that to be a part of my life. I want it to be a part of my life to help American composers develop, because they needed that. They needed those performances to go on to their next step. So I think it really developed partly out of friendship, partly out of the excitement then of working with a live composer, which I thought was, maybe not being a composer, I thought was really spectacular. That I could have a composer next to me and I could ask him a question or her a question,
right,
and maybe change something up, or change, this articulation here, or take out the trombone and put a horn instead, that we could actually be part of the creative process. I could be part of the creative process with the composer. I thought it was wonderful. It really made a tremendous impact on me. So it just became a very natural part of my life. And I thought, why not Americans? Because they're writing in our vernacular. They are our neighbors. They live in our city. I mean, that it seemed to me that was something that wasn't a responsibility. It was a joy. I mean, it was just a great thing to do.
Right. And maybe even at the time, maybe you didn't realize you were joining a long history of trying to carry that torch of like, well, yeah, we all learned this European foundation, but at the same time, then America rose up historically, and then the people that were here made something else.
That's right. That's
Yeah,
right.
and like you said, if it was organic in that way, then you didn't realize it, but then you just took it on, and now you've become a hero.
Well, now it's so much a part of my life that it's something that I love. And of course, these long-term relationships when like especially with Ken Fuchs, who, I remember conducting his graduate recital, I mean his graduation recital in Juilliard. And now to go with him to London Symphony and to be with him when the Grammy came, it was just so gloriously joyful. And it's great to see audiences too. Over the years that I've been conducting, I've seen audiences really become more open-minded to new music. In the beginning, they'd always think, oh, well, we really came for the Beethoven, but now I really think audiences are coming for that mix, the new piece,
Right.
Beethoven, or something they've never heard that's not new, but they're interested in it. So that's been a large part of how I think about programming now.
So in addition to the new and the living music and the living composers, you also obviously have a large repertoire of American music from 19th and 20th century. The works far less played, sometimes completely forgotten, and even less of the time recorded for public consumption. So you've kind of cornered this niche, especially for recording. And was there a particular composer from that earlier era that began that journey, that kind of piqued that interest for you, or was it more of a collection within the genre?
Well, I think it was partly a charge from Naxos too, because when I began to work with the Buffalo Philharmonic, Naxos reached out to me and they were interested in the orchestra and having recordings from the orchestra. And knowing the sound of the orchestra, knowing their environment and the kind of hall they had, I thought early 20th century would be a great time frame for them. But Naxos charged us to find things that were not known. And at first it was like, oh my gosh, it seemed like a daunting prospect to find all of these pieces and to record. But it became just like a labor of love. I mean, there's so many pieces that we found and recorded that now maybe people even have become familiar with. So I think that was a great charge from them, and it happened to fit my way of thinking based upon my sense of believing that not everything, that we don't know everything that's good, that there are a lot of good things out there we don't know. So it was great to work with them. And I remember in one of the earliest CDs we did with Buffalo was Charles Tomlinson Griffis. And Griffis grew up in Elmira, which was this fairly close to Buffalo. I would say maybe a little under 2 hours away. So,
Right.
so there was a sense of, well, why not? I mean, this is one of a composer who grew up in the same sort of region that we're in. And when I started to discover his music, it was so thrilling for me because there's not really, at least I don't find there's not really American impressionist music of a sort of pure type, except for him. I mean, he
Right.
was really writing American impressionistic music. And in his short life, the small amount of music he gave us is quite perfect in that way. So I just fell in love with it, and that was really one of our key early CDs, and we went on from there. Not always American, I mean, often European music, Central European especially, but it's been a great adventure for the orchestra too.
Right. So with Griffiths, with his impressionistic characteristics, what is it? I mean, I had a similar experience. I mean, I haven't made any recordings, but like when I would hear Griffiths, I was like, well, it's hard to tell the difference between Griffiths and Debussy and kind of Ravel, but Ravel has his own thing. But what is it that you think actually differentiates him from Debussy and Ravel as representatives of the entire French impressionistic era?
Well, he loved Debussy and Ravel, so they are his big influences. But I think he also he studied with a great German composer, Engelbert Humperdinck.
Right.
So I think that there's a sense of in some of his music, like the poems of Fiona MacLeod, for instance, and even in the other larger pieces. I think there's more of a Germanic texture there. But then there are some pieces that are just like, not even touching the ground. I mean, they're so light. The White Peacock, for instance, is a piece, it just floats. It could be Debussy. And who knows what it would have become, because again, he was just, the tragedy of Griffis is that he was just achieving a sort of recognition really in the year before he died. He was like, at last, I think Pierre Monteur took a great liking to him all of a sudden, and you can understand the sort of sensibility there.
Right.
And he would have gone on to possibly be one of the most known and lauded American composers. But he died in the flu epidemic. He died in the Spanish flu epidemic. So It was very sad, but it's just amazing. I mean, the CD we made was something that we loved it. I don't think many of the musicians knew the music, but the Pleasure Dome I've done a lot with other orchestras as well, and that maybe is his biggest structural work. But the poems of Fiona MacLeod are quite extraordinary. The poem for flute is also quite extraordinary. So
I found that interesting with all of those pieces on that CD. They are all poem based, and they're all textually based, and they're a very impressionistic thing anyway. And the only one that's not is the poem for flute. But of course, he calls it poem for flute.
That's right.
So still anyway, it's got this sense of like being this French, like, yeah, there's a structure, but not really. And
in that way, he fit right into that whole period in France, don't you think? Because there were the poets and the musicians, at the same salon talking to each other. I mean, Debussy's Afternoon of a Faun actually comes right from a poem by Mallarmé. So, I mean, I think he's found some American poets that he loves, and he's either inspired or actually uses their words. So that must have been a big part of his inspiration. And
right.
I think it's very precious music. I mean, we have so little of it, and it's so special. There's nothing really that is quite like that. So I'm glad that we were able to do that disc.
Right. So since we're kind of comparing them, Griffis died in 1920. Debussy died in 1918. Now, I want to make it clear, I'm not equating Griffis and Debussy. I'm not going to do that. But it's kind of obvious. I mean, while Debussy is a household name, Griffis is a footnote in music history.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, and what are the possibilities for that happening? I mean, you had just said earlier that you pointed out that we have this. I mean, maybe this is towards part of the point, but still to this day, we go to music school and we, like 99% of what we learn about is a very small time period from a very small area in Europe, and that's it. And it's still only a few of those people, those composers. And it's the best music that's ever been written. It's not all of it, but it's some of the best music that's ever been written. But then we get people like this. Okay, he's not a Debussy, and he didn't live long enough. Maybe he might have been, but what is it that makes him nothing now?
Well, I think a lot of it is our own American inferiority complex. Now, maybe that's going away. I don't know, but I know growing up, there was always the distinct feeling that if it came from Europe, it had to be better, whether it was a piece of music or whether it was a conductor or a soloist. It had to be better because they knew somehow they had to have a much longer tradition, of course. And the United States in 1920, or let's say those 2 decades, are just starting to find its way in a music that is really American. When Dvorak came to this country, a decade before that, in the late 1800s, and he's trying to teach Americans how to write American music, and by looking at their folk music and listening to the music of the people, he's finding people here who don't know. I mean, they're writing music based upon Mendelssohn and Schumann because those are their heroes. So at that time, I think American composers weren't taken very seriously. I mean, they might have been played and applauded, but of course, the real music probably came from Germany. That's how people thought about it. So he had that working against him. He had his short life, of course, working against him. He was a teacher. He wasn't in New York City. He wasn't in the maybe the milieu where he could have made more contacts. He was teaching in White Plains or Tarrytown, and it was just far enough from New York to maybe not have those contacts. In fact, this kind of miraculous discovery of his by the conductor, the French conductor, is sort of just something that happened. I mean, he could have easily been totally obscure. So, the fact that Pierre Monteux was about to gave performances of his was almost like a fluke. So, but I think we live with that kind of sort of feeling that Americans didn't really know. It might have sounded nice, but it was not Beethoven, and maybe that's going away. But I still think it's still with us a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I guess even in context, it was a little bit still before there became a quote unquote American sound.
Right.
I mean, there was, and even with Griffis, I mean, we're easily flowingly comparing him with Debussy, and Debussy also was called an impressionist while he was alive, and he rejected the label, which of course sounds accurate to everyone. Every genius in the era that they lived, they were like, "I'm not that." What are you talking about?
Well, that's just the way it is. But it's I don't know. I suppose it was, as you say, there was a lot. America was just finding its way. I mean, there was going to be Copland finding his way with American folk music, and brilliantly doing that. And Gershwin finding his way with melding jazz again organically, just perfect natural marriage of this. And Griffis then is because he admires those composers so much, is finding another voice. And maybe the country doesn't really know what is American music. We don't know. Even today, though, I mean, it's composers are writing in so many different styles.
Right. Maybe that is American music. It's that it's not you can't pigeonhole it in any time period.
That's true.
That may be it. I wanted to go back a little bit to something you'd said earlier about the Buffalo audience in relation to this and the living new music and the slightly older. There was this 2009 Naxos interview with Stephen Schaefer, and you said, due to marketing and perceived audience preferences, it is easy in the United States to keep programming the core repertoire, but it is very exciting to offer unusual repertoire to the BPO audience, who in turn have very enthusiastically received it. Now, I could not agree more with the first point, that the accessibility of the canon is both a blessing because it is the best possible music, and then at the same time it hinders that diversity of programming because we have to keep the lights on and we have to keep the musicians employed, and there's so much money that has to go into it. So people aren't going to come to hear, if the only composer on the program is Charles Griffis or anybody like him, nobody's going to come to that concert, or they're going to be reticent to come, or if you start showing that that's your programming, where you're picking out these obscure composers, regardless of what it sounds like, people, those donors are going to be like, well, what are you doing?
Well, it is difficult. In Buffalo, we had a slight advantage in that we had a couple of music directors, Lucas Foss especially, who was very avant-garde and really on the cutting edge of new music, and to the point that Buffalo became like the epicenter of new American music. And he was not, none of it was easy listening at all. I mean, his music was really, everything he picked was very thorny, very difficult. But the audience built up a sort of respect for, we're doing something special. We're introducing new pieces. And Michael Tilson Thomas also had a lot of very sort of wide-ranging interests in new music. So the background was there. And then I felt that we had to introduce new music to them. Now, I wouldn't do an all Griffis program, as beautiful as I think that music is. And when we were recording it, we did a lot of Griffis that year on the program. So, but I think that slowly audiences have come to say, oh, I knew I was going to enjoy the Mozart Symphony, but I really loved that new piece, or that piece I never heard of by Vítězslav Novák, or even John Adams, because they are seeing it in a different context. So,
right.
And, Grant, I think it's the wrong idea. A lot of marketing directors say, okay, let's ask the audience what they want to hear, and they'll send out a survey. And then they're always surprised when they get pieces like Phantom of the Opera or Vivaldi Four Seasons or Pachelbel Canon. Well, it's not fair. You're putting the audience in a position of having to do research. They're just coming up with this piece they know they like, and it seems like a silly thing to ask them. Why don't we come up with pieces that we think they'll love and introduce them to them, rather than only relying on the few pieces that they remember. And I think the audience would say the same thing. I mean, you're the experts. Show us something good, show us some new music. So I hope that's happening all over the country, that we're integrating either new music, which is very important, or unknown music from the past.
So do you think that the Buffalo audience is particularly unique and that they've embraced this? Or is it like you said, like people, not necessarily just the conductors, but conductors included, the people that make these programs every year after year after year are maybe unable or unwilling to acknowledge that audiences are like that they're willing to take on more new stuff as long as they're satiated with something else that they do already know.
I think you're right. I think that sometimes we're underestimating the audience. They think, oh, they'll never come if we put it. Well, we did a whole evening of Richard Danielpour, 2 hours of a piece by Richard Danielpour. Who's going to come to that concert? They came, So sometimes we're thinking that, oh, no, they'll never accept that. But if you've built up a trust, if the audience trusts what you're doing and they figure, well, I remember that, 2 concerts ago, there was a lot of new music. I didn't think I would like it, but I found it interesting. Then they're likely to come again. And you need to do that. You need to do that. I think that really the worst thing to do is to find those top 20 pieces and keep doing them every year.
So now I found it quite interesting that, but not at all surprising, that you also have a 2012 Naxos recording of orchestral works by Duke Ellington.
Yes.
And it's certainly not a regular composer in the orchestral canon. So how did you come to decide on these pieces? And by the way, obviously, Take the A Train, Black, Brown, and Beige, and Harlem, they're all pretty much what you'd expect from Duke Ellington. And they were more, I think they were more or less, they were transcriptions, they were arrangements for orchestra. But to be honest, I had never heard Three Black Kings or the River Suite, and they are like an intellectual integration of what Gershwin was doing. But it doesn't sound like Gershwin at all, but it still sounds like Duke Ellington, but he's using the orchestra. Like it's used, and yet it's still jazz.
Well, I think he just was so loved as a band leader, and what his band played, and those tunes, and they're great. But he himself was much more than that. I mean, he wrote opera. I mean, he's writing things in his own way, but he wrote opera, he wrote ballet, he wrote choral music, religious music, orchestral music. I mean, the Three Black Kings to me is just. It's an astonishing piece of music. And Black, Brown, and Beige. Yeah. We did them in a couple of these in versions that are somewhat manipulated. Let's say by Maurice Perez, who worked with great knowledge of the score to make them more playable for symphony orchestra. But they are great pieces. They're just great pieces. And I think we wanted to show that this is orchestral music. We didn't really do transcription, with the exception of Take the A Train, which was not by him, but his theme song. They're not really arrangements, but we had to do that. The A Train is an arrangement for orchestra, but these are really, he was envisioning these pieces as concert pieces on the stage. And it takes him out of the realm of great, band music that people love to dance to to something on a different level, and he deserves that. So we're very glad to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that also seems to make sense along with the Naxos vision, which is to like encourage this and spend resources on things that they're not non-existent, but they're far less known. And certainly in this case, like you said, like I mean, I knew that was there, that element of Duke Ellington was there, but I don't think I'd ever like explored it.
No,
So,
but you sort of have to hear it enough, and then when someone hears the recording, they're more likely to call up the Buffalo Philharmonic and say, "How did you get that music?" And we can tell them how to get the music. All of a sudden, they do it,
right.
And that makes it easier. So that's one thing that recordings do for us, is that it makes it much more accessible to someone who's not a conductor, who doesn't want to spend the time looking at the score carefully, just wants to hear it and say, we should do that piece. And I think that's great. So Naxos has really opened the door to a lot of new music.
So you mentioned earlier, also, along with Naxos, you mentioned earlier Richard Danderpour, and your most recent recording, of course, was The Passion of the Yeshua.
Yes.
And that seems like it was an enormous undertaking both times. There was at the Bach Festival, and then again in Buffalo, and I can't imagine. What was that like, taking all of that on?
It's an enormous piece, and Richard will tell you that he's been thinking about this piece for 25 years, at least, of his life, of doing this, because of a mixed background that he has, partly Christian, partly Jewish, partly Arabic. I mean, and it's been something that's been sort of gestating in his head. But it's an enormous piece. I mean, it's a 2-hour evening of this music, and it's based upon, of course, the last day in the life of Christ. But he does some things that are quite different. First of all, he wanted to get a real sense of where this was set, because the whole life of Christ, the whole Christianity has become very Europeanized. Became very Europeanized, and that's the way it's presented. But actually, it comes right from the Jewish man that Christ was, and all of his traditions, and the landscape around him, and his language. Speaking Hebrew. So half of it is in Hebrew, and it's really moving. And you get the sense of that we are close to his life. We're not hearing the story of his life. We're sort of living his life.
Right.
And also something that struck Richard, and this is why he wanted me to conduct it, was in every passion, women have not had a voice. It's always been men who are telling this story. And yet the
thought of that, actually. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah, they're suffering through this whole thing.
Right.
In some cases, they're the only ones who don't run away. So he has two major roles for women. Of course, the Mother of God, Mary, the Mother of God, and Mary Magdalene. There's various views of Mary Magdalene, but we know she was close to Christ and a disciple in a way. So they play a prominent role. And he chose two African American singers for the Christ and the Mother, and Mary, the Mother of God, because he felt that as Christ becomes evolves into who he's meant to be, he becomes disenfranchised. All of a sudden, people are suspicious of him. And so this sense of not being accepted, he thought that was a level that he wanted to introduce in many cases, which over the centuries, African Americans have felt that a feeling of not being on the fringes and not being in the middle. So it's a stunning piece. And Richard has a great gift for writing for voice, and the choral music is spectacular. That's all I can say. It's just hair raising. So
I think you mentioned it was life-changing. I mean, I noticed you said that, and I was like, I mean, you have a plethora of experiences that could be called life-changing for many people, but that's what you called life-changing. Yeah. And I thought that must be.
It was, for me too, to see the Passion in this context, in this kind of much more open context, to hear things sung in Hebrew, to hear a Kaddish sung at the end after Christ's death, and just to be in a different environment was very sort of opened my mind to things that I had learned as a child, of course, in religion, that all of a sudden were different. And I think that's what Richard wanted. And ultimately, and I'm not sure that this was achieved with everyone, but ultimately he wanted to give Christians and Jews the feeling that we all come from the same place. And we all group around this man, Jesus Christ, and we have so much more in common than we think we do. So for him, it was a bringing together. In the context of today's world, where there is so much anti-Semitism and renewal of anti-Semitism, which is horrific on a horrific level, there was some fear in the Jewish community that even setting a passion could incite that feeling. But I think in Richard's voice and in his words that he spoke to people about, the opposite was true for him. It's bringing people together. And he does it. I think he absolutely succeeds.
Well, I mean, the fact that you did it twice, and I know that it's been at least done a couple of more times, like that portends that it's going to be done again and again. Maybe not with a high regularity, because it's such an undertaking. There's got to be I don't know how many people, but it's like I was talking to somebody else about something similar. At least for the chorus, anyway. A chorus that's going to take that on, that's got to be like a 2-year commitment, at least as far as planning.
It is. And we actually had 2 choruses. We had our own Buffalo Philharmonic chorus, who worked very hard on it, and the UCLA sent their chorus. Richard is teaching now at UCLA, and they actually sent their chorus to sing with us. So that was very happy to this sort of very disparate groups. I mean, Buffalo Philharmonic Chorus is a group of amateurs of all ages, but UCLA, of course, were all students, and it was tremendous to have them doing that. So, it's an experience that I think once you live through it, you think about that part of what happened and what in the world at that time very differently.
So, are there any other recordings on the horizon, notwithstanding the pandemic?
Well, we have one that's about to come out by a French composer that you might not know well. His name is not well known. It seems a shame because he's a fantastic composer, Florent Schmidt, with 2 T's, not Schmidt, the German. A composer really living around the time of Debussy and Ravel, but lived much longer than them. He was very long-lived, and his music of tremendous difficulty, color, perhaps a little more Germanic than they were, but still very French. But adding that to the mix, and so that's exciting for us to have that come out. We have so many plans of recording more Kodai and Lucas Foss and all of these things, but we have to take them off the schedule now. We'll put them on.
Right. You got to wait. So I guess one last question on that, the technicality of that, because I'd known a little bit about what Naxos does or doesn't do, but are most of, if not all of these recordings, do they originate from live performances and then you patch them with extra rehearsals?
Well, they're always done in studio after the performances, but we do rehearse and perform them first. And that I think is great, because we live with them for that whole week rehearsing. We give 2 or 3 performances of it, and then the next day we come back to the hall and then record it. But we've lived through a few performances of it, and that really helps. And
I mean, those sessions, they must they're not really musically based sessions to make a recording, are they? I mean, it's kind of picking it apart, and
it's very different. We have a producer who lets us play in big swaths, which we like, but it's a highly focused approach to music, where it has to be perfect, and so you'll go over the same spot 3 or 4 times and then play a little bit more, and it requires a lot of attention. It's actually exhausting. Musicians are totally exhausted afterwards, but it's different skill. But I mean, in the end, it's about the music. So it's music that we love, and we're trying to perform it.
Right.
And our producer helps us with that, because he knows that's better for our orchestra to be able to play, not to go note by note. So.
Right. Well, thank you, JoAnn. I'm sure we'll be able to do this again. I guess
I'd always enjoy it. I miss our talk, so you just tell me when.
You've got a few more American composers from this little niche that I'm trying to concentrate on. You've got them in your back pocket, so I'm sure we'll pick out another one.
About them. Thank you. Well, you stay well, you and Kim, and I hope I see you face to face. I'm sure I will sooner.
Yeah, definitely going to get back to that. Well, thank you again. I appreciate it.
Thank you. This was great fun. Thank you.
If you like what you have heard and want to support the advocacy of American orchestral music, please consider signing up to donate regularly at patreon.com for our continued production of this podcast. Also, subscribe for updates wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss an episode.